What's up, React Amsterdam? It feels so awesome to be here with you all today. Fun fact about me, actually, aside from the fact that I used to be a DJ, I actually lived in Amsterdam for a month last summer. It's actually one of my favorite cities in the world. There's just something really magical about this place, whether it's cruising the canals on the boats, or the stroopwafels, or the tulips, or the cheese. There's just something really magical about being here, and I'm so thankful to present here to you all today and actually talk about something that brings me a lot of joy, which is helping people with GraphQL. So I'm an engineering manager at Apollo, where I lead a team focused on developer experience. So really, my goal is to make sure all 1,500 of you in this room, I don't know, there's definitely a lot of you, but to make sure that each and every one of you are successful with GraphQL. So what is GraphQL? Even if you haven't worked with GraphQL before, you don't need prior knowledge of it to get anything out of my talk today. Really, the most important thing to remember is that GraphQL is a way to communicate between a client and an API. So oftentimes we think of this API as a GraphQL server, but it actually doesn't have to be. It can even be a local cache, and we're actually going to see that later. But the way that you communicate with GraphQL is through a query, like the one that you see in the middle. So the client will send this query, and then the API returns back one response in exactly the same shape of the query that you asked for. So I've seen a lot of GraphQL talks before. Now's about the time, right after kind of somebody gives the intro spiel, about they'll probably either compare it to REST, or maybe they'll even go through some of the technical benefits. But I'm not actually going to do that today, because I want to take a different angle on GraphQL that you might not have seen before. So to me, GraphQL, it's really not about data over the wire. It's not about smaller payloads, fewer round trips, and it's not about preventing overfetching. So yes, these are all like technical benefits of GraphQL, but to me, they're actually not the most compelling reasons to adopt GraphQL in the first place. Because, rolling GraphQL out to an organization, it's a really big investment, so you should make sure, you're doing it for the right reasons. Instead, I actually think the best part about GraphQL and the most compelling reason to adopt it is the massive productivity boost that it brings to developers. So the excellent developer experience is where GraphQL really shines, and it's the reason why your team should adopt it. And maybe this is a little bit controversial. You're probably wondering, why should we make a serious, technical decision based on developer experience? Shouldn't we really just be optimizing for the user experience instead? I actually, I think it's a balance. I think developer happiness and productivity is so important because it helps us ship products faster, it helps attract the best engineers to our teams, and once they're there, it helps us retain them once they join. So, what does great developer experience actually look like? And in the words of the great Marie Kondo, great developer experience should spark joy. And while it's not always possible to KonMari your developer tooling and get rid of the ones that you hate, Webpack, just kidding. Webpack's an awesome tool, but sometimes I get frustrated setting it up. So it's not always possible to KonMari your developer tooling, but you can make some more informed choices for future technologies down the road. So, what does it actually mean for a developer tool to spark joy? And after all, I think it's a little bit subjective. I mean, although I manage a developer experience team, I think everyone's answer is kind of a little bit different. And I don't even have all the answers myself. So I took it upon myself to do some super scientific research. So I just posted something on Twitter. I added in some bribery for good measure to coerce people to respond. But I was actually super, super impressed by the quality of the responses. I read all 100 of them, and it was really, really awesome to see what great developer experience means to you. So thank you if you were one of the people that participated. One of the things that I noticed is that there was actually a lot of really common themes that came up. So the most common by far was that the tools really shouldn't get in the way as you're developing. Ideally, they should be as non-obtrusive as possible so you can just focus on the code and kind of get in that flow state. You really don't want your development environment to get in the way. So that was probably the most popular theme that I saw come up a lot. The second is that they should also be predictable. So given the same inputs, you're going to receive the same output. And the API should be also intuitive enough for you to kind of fall into that pit of success. And while we want our tools to kind of get out of our way as much as possible, we also want them to kind of tell us immediately if there's a bug or an error. And really, I think the closer the feedback is to our editor and as we're typing, the better the experience will be. So in addition to kind of like themes, a lot of you also mentioned specific tools that really fit these principles. So I was just kind of thinking, like, remember the first time you used Prettier? Like, it was really amazing. Like, all of a sudden, I could just write this, like, really janky, like, unindented code and then, like, magically hit save, and, like, it was all fixed. And it was really, like, a magical experience. And now it's just something that we're all so used to, and it's never really something that you think about anymore. But I think, you know, the team who built that did a really great job at making a non-obtrusive rule that kind of just, non-obtrusive tool that just gets out of the way and lets you focus on writing code. I also think React does a really nice job of being predictable. So, you know, with React, your UI is a function of your props and your state. So given the same inputs, you're going to expect the same output, and its immutability as well. And then finally, we have VS Code and TypeScript, which are amazing together. They're always giving you kind of constant feedback about the code that you're writing and really helping you fix bugs before they happen. So I think, you know, in addition to just having a really great developer experience, I think the other thing that these tools all have in common is that they really filled a void in developers' lives. Tools with great developer experience, they solve problems. And this is exactly the way that I felt when I first learned GraphQL. So like any new technology, like it definitely took me a couple weeks to kind of wrap my head around it. But once I did, it was so amazing to see how much more productive I became building React apps. And that's because GraphQL solved a real problem for me. I think, you know, data fetching in React, it's not always the best experience. And that's because, you know, in addition to React kind of being unopinionated about your data layer, it's also because we have to write a lot of manual code. And a lot of this code makes up the majority of our apps. So this is a tweet from Adam. He's an engineer at Airbnb, and 90% of their 2 million line code base is literally dedicated to styling and data fetching. So that's huge. And I think, you know, if we want to optimize the developer experience, and if the majority of our time is spent data fetching, that's probably where we really want to start if we're improving the front-end development experience on our teams. So I think to really get the most out of React, you need a data layer. So here's an example of some data fetching code with hooks. And sorry for people in the back if you can't see it. We're not going to go into it too in depth. I think hooks are really great, and I think they're a definite improvement over the class component model when it comes to reusability. But they don't solve the data fetching problem. So when I look at this code, a couple questions come to mind. So first, like, what's the shape of my data? I have this like data prop at the bottom that I'm passing to this results component, but I don't know like what it is. In order to figure out the shape of my data, I'm either going to have to like console log it, go into Postman, like make an API request, or bug one of the backend developers on my team. So that's definitely, something that takes a little bit of effort and kind of breaks you out of your flow. The second thing is, how do I track loading and error states? Is this code that I'm going to have to write myself? Generally, you're going to be handling it a similar way. You could probably abstract that into some sort of like custom hook, but it's definitely something that you're going to have to write yourself. And then finally, how do I cache it? So as soon as this component unmounts, you're not going to have your data anymore. So how do we make that persistent, and how do we make sure that page transitions, you're not going to lose your data? So I think like when people usually need a cache, the first thing they do is they take their data fetching code and they dump it into Redux. But Redux at its core is just a simple event emitter. I think Redux is really great, like it's a really elegant programming model, but at the end of the day, like it's an event emitter. And in order to make it behave like a cache, you have to layer a bunch of middleware on top of it. You have to layer a bunch of packages like normalizer. You have to write your own selectors. You have to write a lot of code. And the same thing goes for context as well, although it doesn't really have kind of the boilerplate problems. It was really designed to solve the problem of passing props down multiple levels. It's not a cache, and so when your provider unmounts, all of your data is going to disappear with it. And it's also pretty difficult to. There's a couple gotchas, with context, and if you're not using that single child, it's going to re-render the rest of your tree, and it's really easy to kind of cause performance problems if you are not careful. So what we really need is a cache. We don't want to make an event emitter try to behave like a cache. We don't want context to behave like a cache. But sometimes I think we sometimes go overboard with caches and we try to stuff everything in there. So I want everyone to raise their right hand and please repeat after me. I promise. A little louder. I promise that I won't put all my UI state into my cache. Okay, great. Thank you all so much. You all heard it here first. Please don't put all your UI state into your cache. I think that's kind of what happened with Redux. We all got a little too overboard and overzealous. But yeah, UI state is great. Like React hooks, like useState is amazing. Try to see how far you can get with that first before you start dumping things into your cache. So I think really the key to kind of improving our lives as React developers is optimizing this data layer, since it's really where you spend the most of your time. It's also about choosing the right tools for the job, like a data cache. So I think if we can do those two things, optimizing our data layer and choosing the right tools, then we can really improve our developer experience. And I think with GraphQL, I think we can really do this. So I can show you better than I can tell you. So the next part of this talk is going to be some live demos so you can see for yourself that Apollo is really kind of this missing piece, this missing data layer that makes React come to life. So while I am getting set up, can everyone please just have a quick moment of silence for the conference Wi-Fi gods? Thanks. Okay. All right. How is the font size back there? Can someone clap 2 times if it's too tiny? I heard a couple claps. I'm not sure how much more I can kick it up because it might be a little bit difficult to see, but let me see. Okay. All right. We're going to try with this and see how far we go. Okay, so some of you might have seen this app before. This is actually the Redux tutorial app. So it's what you go to first probably when you're learning how to do Redux, and it is essentially an app that fetches data from a Reddit API, displays it on a list, and then it also has this refresh button for you to update your data. And it also has this little picker too, so you can kind of switch between different subreddits. So if you're familiar with Redux apps, this probably looks like something you've seen before. We have a lot of different actions for selecting and invalidating, requesting, refetching. There's a lot of different action creators that we have to write ourselves in order to correctly model this data. And then we have our reducers as well. So, selecting, invalidating, requesting. It looks like we are not handling errors here, but yeah, pretty like common stuff. So let's see what would happen if we rewrote this app to GraphQL, and also TypeScript as well. I think TypeScript is rapidly becoming a really important part of the modern app stack, so I kind of wanted to see how it would look with TypeScript as well. So I am going to switch over to that app. Cool. Let me try to squeeze this over so it's not. So this is the same app. The only difference here is I have not wired up this timestamp yet. Whoa. But it's something that we're going to get to in a bit. So this is the same app. It's built with GraphQL. It uses Apollo server for the GraphQL API and then Apollo client on the front end to connect that API to React. So this is really all it takes to set up a GraphQL server. It's literally like 40 lines of code. The main gist is that you model your data with a schema, and it kind of looks like TypeScript or flow definitions if you're familiar with that. And then your resolvers. Your resolvers are kind of where the magic happens. They can be asynchronous, and they can literally do anything. They can fetch data, connect to a database. It's really up to you. And then finally, we just kind of connect our schema and our resolvers to our server. So this is literally all the JavaScript that you have to write to get started with a GraphQL API. I think when some people kind of hear, oh, GraphQL API, they get a little bit intimidated because they think, maybe they're not familiar with server-side technologies, but this is all the JavaScript that you have to write. So let's go into the actual app. So one thing you'll notice is that there are a lot less files. In the Redux app, we had separate files for action creators, our reducers, and then finally our connect higher order component that connected everything together. So here we can actually do it in one file. You'll notice that we have this query here. So this get subreddit is actually what's fetching the data from our API. And the way we the way that we kind of kick off that query is we bind it to our UI with this query component. So you'll see we are using React hooks to get the input from the dropdown, and then we're using that as a variable to our GraphQL API. And the other really nice thing about using GraphQL and using Apollo is that you don't have to handle your loading and error states manually. So all of this is really tracked for you, and it's exposed by this object that's passed to the render prop function in your query component. And it also has a lot of other really nice utilities as well. So it gives you a function to refetch. You don't have to track that yourself. It also gives you fine-grained network status information, so you don't have to track that either, which is pretty cool. And then finally, once we have our data, we just render our UI, and that's kind of what you see over there. So one of the things that's really cool about GraphQL is because of that statically typed schema, you can connect that to all of your developer tooling. So Apollo has a VS Code extension. We kind of did a soft launch of it. We're planning to officially launch it very soon, but I'm going to give you kind of a sneak peek of what it would look like to develop React apps with this extension. So one thing that's really cool about GraphQL, if you've ever kind of explored on the GraphQL playground, you get that really nice autocomplete and you can kind of see what's available. So I just press Control Space and I see all of the fields that are available for me to query from without leaving my editor. I also get to see what their types are. So I have author to choose from, that's a string, title, and then what's super cool is if you have doc strings in your schema, the docstring documentation will actually appear right in your editor. So this kind of ups field, we don't really know what that is, but because the documentation is already in our schema, we know that it's the number of upvotes a post has received. So this is really cool. You can also hover over any field in your query and see exactly what type it is. So you have full visibility into what's going on with your GraphQL API without ever having to leave your editor or console log the shape of your data or like bother the grumpy backend developer that sits behind you. So the other really cool thing too is it has autocomplete, but it also warns you about errors. So this auth field right here, you have this misspelling. I make typos all the time. So this immediately spots it and prevents you from making that error. And it tells you cannot query field auth and type post. Did you mean author? Why yes, thank you, VS Code. That is what I meant. So the other cool thing that you can do is if you want to peek into your schema, maybe you have a really large schema, you can just actually peek it right in line from within your editor. So you're not having to like jump into a separate repository in order to access your GraphQL API. You just have your schema right there available for you to view. So this is really cool. I think the power of VS Code is that it really gives you this automatic feedback from within your editor, and it just makes it so seamless as you're developing. You're not having to like interrupt your flow to like console log the shape of your data. You always know what's available to you at any given time. So the second thing that I think is really cool is just how well GraphQL integrates with TypeScript. So just quick show of hands, who's a TypeScript fan? Oh wow, like that's a lot. Awesome, okay, so you all are gonna love this next demo. What's really cool about Apollo's integration with TypeScript, is that we have this CLI tool that actually automatically generates TypeScript definitions for you just with a command. So if I just save this file right here, this author type should automatically appear on the left. Hopefully you can see this when it happens. Okay, so yeah, so the author field just appears right here. I remove it, I save, author goes away, I add it back in. It's right there. So this is really cool. We can just kind of add fields to our queries, and the Apollo CLI is automatically going to pick that up. And then, you know, magically, we have like statically typed query components. It's really cool. You don't have to write any of this yourself. And this is something really unique about GraphQL that you don't get with any other state management kind of framework today. So the other thing that's really cool as well, let me just see if I can pop out my terminal. Is that having statically typed components really helps you catch errors before they happen. So if I go in here, I can see, I'm just going to take out this kind of nullability check right here, and I'm going to hit save. So the object is possibly null. So I kind of hover over this post right here, and I find that because of the types in my schema, I know that this is a nullable type, because all types in GraphQL are nullable by default. But the typings literally kind of carry with you down your React component tree and just prevent you from making mistakes before they happen. So this is kind of really to show you the power of statically typed React components. I think it's amazing. Obviously, you don't have to use TypeScript to use GraphQL, but I think they play really nicely together and just give you a really excellent developer experience that kind of just gets out of your way and lets you focus on the code. Okay. So the next thing that I'd like to show you is also pretty cool. It's a little bit future forward, but I think it's really exciting. So one of the really interesting things about using Apollo is that you can actually use GraphQL to manage your local state. And I know it sounds a little bit crazy and like, kind of out there, but once you see it, it's actually really cool. So oftentimes we have server data and we want to augment it with a single field, for example. So maybe we have a shopping cart type and one of the items in the cart we want to be able to save on the client whether or not it's selected, that piece of local state. So what Apollo allows you to do is it allows you to model your local state alongside your remote data with GraphQL. So to do that, all we're going to do here is just create this last updated field. And that's what's going to allow us to hook up this button right here. So we're getting an error, and that's totally expected because this field, the last updated, is not in our schema. So we can actually just add that to our schema right now. So const client schema equals. And the way we do that is we just extend our server type. So we're going to extend our subreddit type. And then we are going to make that last updated field a string. So we're not done yet. We need to now hook up this last updated field to our resolvers. So resolvers on the client are exactly the same as resolvers on the server. And that's why this is such a really nice, elegant programming model, because you literally learn it once, and it's applicable to both your front end and your back end code. So we're just going to create some resolvers, subreddit, last updated, and it's going to call this generate date function that I created here. Great. So then once we have our resolvers and we have our client schema, we need to let Apollo client know about those resolvers. So one of the things you can do, you can actually just, when you instantiate your Apollo client, you put your resolvers in the constructor, or you can add them dynamically, which is really nice for things like code splitting. So we're just going to do that here. Add resolvers. And then finally, the last thing that we're going to do is I hard-coded up this, but we're going to make this our data.subreddit.last updated. And if I save this, fingers crossed it works. Yeah, so now it works. So we can just refresh this, and it will update, and that's really just Apollo local state. But there's one more thing that I'd like to show you as well. So something that's also really, really cool is that you automatically get type definitions for your local state as well. So this is something that you don't get with any other kind of state management solution out there. Not only can you statically type your remote data, but you can statically type your local data as well seamlessly right inside your editor. So that's what it's like to develop React apps with Apollo. What do you all think? It's super cool. So as I was going through this, I knew that it was definitely kind of less code than the Redux app, but I wanted to see exactly how much. So the client, the GraphQL server, and all the TypeScript definitions are still 40% less than the code that you would have to write with Redux. So this is really amazing. I think it's just a testament to how how much time you save with GraphQL and how much it boosts your productivity. The other thing that I think is really cool and kind of the next iteration of this is I think our data layer is going to become smarter over time. So this is a screenshot actually from our commercial product, But because it's hooked up to our trace warehouse, we actually get the metrics and the timing of how long it takes this query to execute right within our editor. So we can really pinpoint slow queries as we're typing them. And maybe in the future, you have a slow query and you have a tooltip that pops up and says, hey, would you like to add defer to defer this result? So I think that's kind of really the future of this. Our tooling and our data layer are going to work together, and they're going to become smarter over time. So all of this is really exciting. I think it's the future, but I think the best part about it all is that it's approachable. You can do this today. You can incrementally migrate to GraphQL without writing a ton of code. Maybe just convert over one of your REST endpoints, try it out, see how it is. If you don't like it, take it out. But if you like it, then you have a really great starting point. And I think together, using React as your UI component-based framework, Apollo as your data layer, and integrating a design system, those are the three ingredients you need to build modern apps in 2019. If you have any questions about GraphQL, want to talk to me about Apollo, have any questions about my talk, feel free to either find me later at the after party or reach out to me on Twitter. Thank you all so much.